to Phobos and got inside Phobos, then if they did this, say, 15 or 20 years ago, then they've back-engineered this whole thing, and they know everything. But I think they already knew everything, and they're the ones who fed the Nazis all of the information that allowed them to achieve the things that they did. And it's all part of this Project Good, to get out of Dodge. And if you think about it and you start looking back, you can see that this is what I mean when I say the central organizing principle of society is disappearing. And I think Obama actually knows this. And because there's no need now for all of these people. There's no need for all of this industry. There's no need for any of it. And they pulled the plug on us, and we're kind of drifting around looking for something to focus on, because we've essentially been mind-controlled and focused solely on the helping the Aryans achieve their task of getting out of here and getting underground on Mars. Now, they have told the managers that they've left behind, which we call the New World Order, that they can have the underground bases under Denver Airport and, you know, all over the place that they've been building. But I think the joke's on the New World Order, because if a coronal mass ejection of the size that is described in the Piranha text hits, all the oxygen is going to be sucked right out of the ground. The ions are going to pierce through the whatever covering they have, and they're going to get it. They're going to get killed. They could even get killed on Mars if it was a strong enough solar flare, but because Mars does not have a magnetic field and because it doesn't have tectonic plates, it's pretty safe there, especially if you're on the other side of Mars when it hits. So this is actually, if you examine the sun panel on the Cross of Henday, you'll see that there's an angry sun face and obviously a kind of medieval artistic motif trying to simulate what solar flares look like. And then you see that there's 4 planets surrounding the sun, essentially saying that, you know, the 4 inner planets get hit, and but Mars gets hit less because it's so far out. Another interesting thing about all this is that Fulcanelli tells us that alchemy is the science of these people. And he says all alchemy begins in Aries, which is Mars. And for 20 years, I've been contemplating that, trying to figure out what that meant. And I think I've got it now, just like I think I'm pretty sure that 322 is the magic number of the first day of Aries, or Mars, or March. And so you start adding all of this together, a holistic synopsis is created that explains almost all of the high weirdness that's been going on, and doesn't have to run off with this alien problem. They are alien in a sense. They are extraterrestrial because they left the planet for 200,000 years or whatever and came back, but they're still human. And then all of the myths begin to make a lot of sense. Andrew Collins, the great writer, wrote a book called From the Ashes of Angels. And it's all about the Book of Enoch, and which is one of our oldest books, of course. And in the Book of Enoch, they tell how these Nephilim, couple with Earth women and create these demigod babies. And he goes back into the ancient texts and he describes what these babies look like. And they're chalk white skin and white or blonde hair and shining blue eyes. And the thing is that in some tribes, these children were exalted and celebrated, and they were allowed to spread their progeny, create progeny throughout the tribes and couple with all the women in the tribes. And in other tribes, like in Africa, these were considered demon children, and they were killed. And even to this day, in several African tribes, they banish albino children from the tribe as soon as they're born and call them demon children. And that's because they don't want anything to do with these Aryans. For instance, in Jewish history, if you have a red-headed child with chalk white skin, this kid is exalted among the Hebrews and among the Jews, and the same thing among the Europeans. Europeans, of course, are probably the closest related to these Aryans. I don't want anyone to go after any races or anything for what I'm saying, because it's not them. It's another group of people who have remained hidden and still remain hidden. And it seems as if sometimes they can come out into the open. And that's the stories of Count Saint-Germain, who was reported to have pale white skin, and he would take a white substance, a white powder, which he said protected him from the sun. And he, of course, was rumored to live 200 or 300 years, may even still be alive. What's interesting, though, is that 666 years before the end target date, or the original target date of the Piranhas, is 1776, and this is, of course, when the Illuminati began, and, of course, the United States of America. Now, my friend and anthropologist Robert Lawler, who has a great video we're putting out called The Sacred Geometry of Time next year, has gone into this whole thing, and he's really my mentor on all this, and has showed me a lot of this. He shows that there are 3 places on Earth that in the monuments that are in these 3 places, now, I'll take that back. Almost every ancient monument has these hyperdimensional Piranha numbers built into them. But there's 3 places on Earth that have them more than any others. One is the Giza Plateau in Egypt. 2 is Stonehenge. And the 3rd is the U.S. Capitol. And, the implications of that are staggering. It's as if, how in the world could the founders of the United States know about these ancient texts and their number systems and their history and everything, yet they appear to have, and I'm trying to say that the creation of the United States may have been to facilitate this exodus that's going on. And that's why everything that's happened in this exodus kind of started here in the United States. And because there's no way it could be an accident that they keep putting in these geometries and these number systems into the Capitol and into the Washington Monument and even into the canal that lays between the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial is even built on these number systems. And so you just finally throw up your hands. The Cross of Henday, of course, is also proof that someone knows about the coronal mass ejections at the end of the age. And here's the real kicker, George. If you take the word iron, which is this age, the Iron Age. It also means Aryan. It comes from the same root word. So you could say that this is the Aryan Age. And this is the age when the Aryans re-emerge and create civilization, not because they're kind and want to make great buildings and everything, but because they're creating a way for them to build these giant arcs in secrecy with us as their slaves. And I could go on and on. I have a lot of proof of this. I'm going to be putting it in my new film, which I tongue-in-cheek call Disclosure, because I know why they're never going to ever really have a disclosure, because they don't want this knowledge out. Now, NASA has to know this. They have to know it. There's absolutely no way. It's interesting that the people who founded NASA were, of course, the Germans who brought their technology here. And I think that NASA has been doing a twofold plan. One is to help facilitate this project, and two, there's a whole bunch of naive people in NASA who really think they're just exploring outer space and looking at planets and everything, and they keep coming up against these Aryan craft, and they don't know what to make of it. They follow their crafts around. They follow the space shuttle around. They're photographed by the space shuttle. They send probes to Mars, and they find blocks of wood and statues and farmland, and they're scratching their head going, what? And they don't quite get it, but maybe they will now. And when I saw Hoagland's work on Phobos, I said, that's it. We found one of their arcs. We know now that there's no way that could be anything but manufactured. Interestingly enough, Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, knows about this. He was allowed into the Oxford Medieval Library, of which only he could read these ancient Finnish texts, the Edda myths from the Nordic myths, and he wrote it all down in Lord of the Rings. And the elves are the Aryans. They're tall, they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned, and they're leaving for the West at the end of the age. They're abandoning the Earth. And in the ancient Nordic text, leaving for the West was a euphemism for going to Mars. They literally thought that they were from Mars, that the gods were from Mars. And so you couple all of this work that I've been doing and Robert Lawler's been doing, and then you bring in Joseph Farrell and Richard Hoagland and a few other people, and the daunting truth stands before you, and there's no need for aliens. There's no need for anything too exotic, because it's really right there in front of us. And like, for instance, Kut Humi, who told Madame Blavatsky all of the things that she wrote down, she reports that he was tall and pale white. Over and over throughout the story of the occult, we find these strange, bizarre creatures who keep appearing, and frankly, from what I hear, they're quite freakish looking. These Aryans, these Brill, they're very skinny, and they have very, very white skin and huge eyes, and these are the Nords, that the aliens
that people have said they've seen. Right?
Exactly. I knew a guy who was hiking. He was an avid hiker. I knew him in the 70s, and he told me that he was hiking in the Rockies, and he saw a UFO. And he saw it land in a valley in these hidden mountains, and he hiked for 2 hours to get to where he thought he saw it land. And he looked over the rock, and he saw 4 very tall, blonde-haired people examining the craft. And he said they were speaking in German. And from that time on, I've been wondering, what is going on here? And I think now I've reached the conclusion that the answer, while fantastic, is all in these ancient Indian texts, of which have been completely dismissed by scholars, but I think are actually the most important myths of all. And when you couple that with L.A. Waddell, and that's you can find all of his books on Amazon, and his greatest book is Makers of Civilization in Race and History, but all of his books are well worth reading. He seals it up. He ties everything together. He doesn't know about the Mars part, but he says explicitly now, this is a guy who's a major historian at the University of London, a scholar who can read hieroglyphs, Sumerian, Sanskrit, Chaldean, cuneiform. He says that the Nephilim are obviously the Aryans, and this is in the 20s. And these books have been completely suppressed. And in this, we can also understand why the U.S. allowed the plundering of the Baghdad Museum, and maybe why we are in Iraq. They do not want these cuneiform tablets to be found because the entire history of this thing is on them. And we know that if indeed the cover story that they told us that the Baghdadians came into the Baghdad Museum without the Marines knowing and swiped thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets, if that's true, then they would be showing up on the black market, and they're not. I know millionaires who would really pay a lot of money to get their hands on these tablets, and they're not showing up. That's because they were not raided. The museum was not raided by the people in Baghdad. It was raided by others who don't want this story out. This is why L. Austin Waddell's work has been completely suppressed, because he found it, he discovered it, and if it had gotten out, then we would have figured this out before. Now they're leaving, and what's interesting also about this is most of what they did was in the Andes since World War II. Most of where this technology